we're told in 8 days a certain amount of vanadium-48 decays to 1 over root 2 of its original amount. And then it asks what is its half-life. So let's try to figure this out. Let's first try to write out a function to represent the decay of vanadium-48. And then we'll try to figure out what we know, what we're given, and then what we're trying to figure out. So first off, let's introduce some variables. Let's let n of t represent the amount of vanadium-48, which can just be V superscript 48, and let's just say it's in milligrams. Let's let n sub 0 represent the initial amount, of vanadium-48, and this has to be in milligrams as well. And let's let t subscript 1/2 represent the half-life of vanadium-48 in days, because here it says in 8 days a certain amount of vanadium-48 decays to 1 over root 2 its initial amount. So let's let t subscript 1/2 represent the half-life of vanadium-48 in days. Now let's see if we can sort of piece together an equation to figure this out. Well, I've got that n of t is equal to the initial amount. So how this would work is if I had some initial amount, n subscript 0, and its half-life was t subscript 1/2, I'd multiply it by its initial amount by 1/2, every time that this half-life went by, so every t subscript 1/2 days. So that means I'm going to do n subscript 0 times a half to the power of t over t subscript 1/2. This is actually a general equation for modeling the amount of a quantity that undergoes exponential decay if you know its half-life and you know the initial amount. So this is a general equation. It's better to just come up with the equation on your own, because if you try to memorize this, you're probably not going to remember this equation. So let's figure out what we know. We know that n of 8, whoops, sorry guys. We know that n of 8, after 8 days, there's 1 over root 2 of the initial amount of vanadium. So there's 1 over 2 times the initial amount, which we're saying is this n subscript 0, and that's equal to n subscript 0 times 1/2 to the power of 8 over the half-life. Now we have an equation, actually. We can divide, if n subscript 0 is not 0, we can just divide both sides of the equation by the initial amount. So those factors divide out. Presumably the initial amount is not 0 milligrams, because presumably we have some kind of initial amount of vanadium-48. So we end up getting that 1 over root 2 is equal to 1/2 to the power of 8 divided by its half-life. Now I can rewrite both of these. 1 over root 2 I can rewrite as 1 over 2 to the power of 1/2. So I've rewritten this so that each side has the same base. And now that the bases are the same, I know that in order for the left side of this equation to be equal to the right side, well, 1/2 should be equal to 8 over the half-life. You can solve this equation. You can take the reciprocal of both sides and then multiply both sides by 8. And you should get that or just cross multiply, and you should get that the half-life is equal to 16. So therefore, the half-life is 16 here, but we have to think about what the units are, and we can go back to what we said T subscript 1/2 represents. It represents the half-life of vanadium 48 in days. So the half-life, therefore the half-life is 16 days.